G'day, David.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah, very good, thanks, mate. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Like I've put the hat on because the hair's getting a little bit out of control. You can kind of see my silver wings, starting to explode from the sides. But we're doing good. We're doing good.
Extremely professional of me there, just completely covering up the camera with my hand to turn the sound up. I would say, don't worry about that. I think it took about a week of self-isolation for me to take the razors and give myself a mohawk, and now it's just growing back. Um, and actually, I left the charger for the razor in Belgium, so there's no hope in hell of me ever getting that for another 6 months or so. So I'm kind of stuck with this.
I know.
I don't mind it. It's coming in nicely. The beard's coming in nicely too.
Yeah,
Actually, I did
yeah.
also in honor of this. I threw on my Starward T-shirt because
Well, look at
I got
you.
one of these when I saw Pete and Sam. I think it was in Cardiff a couple of months back, which is fantastic. Anyway,
Yeah.
g'day to everyone, and welcome to Malts with Mates. I'm some whiskey bloke, and my guest today is David Vitale of Starward, New Distillery in Australia. David, how you doing, mate?
Very well, thank you. It's great to be on the show. I'm pretty excited to catch up again.
Oh God, it would be good. So, first of all, I think you're in America right now. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I moved here March last year with the family to kind of build the brand in the United States, which has been a dream of mine from day one to kind of build the business into something that was broadly available around the world, but
Hmm.
also particularly in the United States, which is kind of, I think, the Mount Everest of particularly from a craft whiskey brand perspective, and also whiskey not from America. So it's sort of like climbing it with a wind as well. So yeah.
No, I can completely understand that because if you're going to be a whiskey, if you're not being sold in America, then you are cutting yourself off from the largest market. It's a weird thing, but the people that you have in America as well, the whiskey drinkers, the bartenders, the people that can do something with it, the people that are going to love it. It's there's nowhere else really like it. So I can understand that. But that you're 8 hours behind. I think it's midday for you.
Midday, that's right. Yeah.
So normally one of my first questions is, what are you drinking today? But I don't know if it's a bit early for you to be on the whiskey right now.
Well, funny you
I
should
won't. I
mention
won't judge
that.
you if you are.
I did actually just have some twofold on my desk, and I thought I was going to crack some of that for this quality. So technically, I'm being responsible.
Don't worry, because I tell you what, you can walk us through it. Because I've actually got right here my own
Oh, look.
bottle of twofold, and there's only a little bit left. I got this. I think last week it came from the Whiskey Exchange, and it's absolutely cracking stuff. But we'll dive into that a bit later. Right now,
Yeah.
can you tell everyone who's watching who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Yeah. So I'm David Vitale. I'm the founder of Starward Whiskey. The idea for this was actually born in 2007. And at that point in time, the Australian craft whiskey scene was very, very, very nascent. But one thing that was very abundantly clear was that, we could make great whiskey. Most of it was from Tasmania, but there was a few distilleries on the mainland as well. And the exciting thing for me, I guess, was that I'd come from a craft beer passion. It wasn't like this instilled whiskey kind of knowledge from a generational perspective. We drank a lot of red wine, table wine at home growing up. So my passion was beer. I used to make a lot of homebrew and way more than I could drink myself, and used to give it to friends, and actually thought about setting up a craft microbrewery at some point.
Hmm.
And that was the idea that kind of came to fruition, or was bubbling up in 2007. Was this idea for an organic Tasmanian beer? But for all of you that I'm sure Tasmania is the island state, and it's equally as difficult to get beer from Hobart, Tasmania, the capital, to Melbourne, which is 800 kilometers away, as it is to get it to the west coast of the United States. It's a really, really a logistically challenged market. And so I kind of figured that, good beer doesn't travel well at the best of times. Having these logistical challenges in place was not a great sort of plan. So I shelved that idea and then walked into the Lark Distillery Bar. So Lark Tasmanian Whiskey is one of the founding whiskies of Australia in this modern era. And I just couldn't believe what I was looking at. Like I had a pot still over there and like 200 single malt whiskies on the back bar. And I kind of got really excited by that in terms of, wow, these single malts are really the craft beers of the whiskey world. That was kind of the mindset that I had at that point in time, and was fascinated by the differences in character and flavor, not just by region but by distillery. Just like craft beers, they had a house style, even though they might be in that Bayside region. And I fell in love, and so very quickly, and could see the affinity, like the similarities in process too, right? Obviously, single malt whiskies effectively start off as a beer that's unhopped that you then distill. So for me, it was like, wow, I could really get into this and discover something a little bit more about the world of whiskey. And I thought, I had some confidence that obviously the Tasmanians had done a good job of it. So if they could do it, so could I. And so we started to think about what it would mean to be an Australian whiskey. I think those founding distilleries really took a big leaf out of the single malt Scotch whiskey playbook. And if you look at their design, both in terms of flavor, but also the bottles, the shapes of the bottles, the architecture of the labels, they're very much a tip of the hat to the Scotch whiskey world. In fact, it's not there anymore, but one of the sites used to say we make Tasmanian whiskey in the finest of Scottish traditions. And for me, it was like, there's so much more than that. They're amazing whiskies. But I kind of figured from a drinker's perspective, if I'm going to buy a whiskey made in the finest of Scottish traditions, I'm probably going to buy a Scotch. And so to me, it was then like, well, what does it mean then to be an Australian whiskey? What is it that we do really well? How do we set ourselves apart? And, if I want to be in the sharing cabinet of these whiskies from around the world, what is it that we're going to do differently to mean that they'll choose a Starward over a Scotch whiskey, an Irish whiskey, a bourbon, a rye, Japanese whiskey? It's got to stand for something different to those things. And of course, coming from that brewing mindset, for me, it was about the grains and what we could do from that perspective to really tell the story of, the agricultural story of whiskey, but also the barrels where a lot of that flavor comes from. So with that in mind, we started to explore a little bit about what we could use locally to mature our whiskey. And the obvious candidates are eucalyptus and blackwood and all of these interesting local species of lumber, but they don't make great barrels. A lot of them leak. Eucalyptus is very, very, very pungent in terms of its aroma and flavor profiles. Probably kill you in too much of it. And blackwood is a great vessel, but it doesn't really impart any flavor. So we figured that American and French oak and European oaks was still going to be our world, the tried and tested in terms of the world of barrels. But instead of using port from Portugal and Spanish sherry, why not source local Australian wines, fortified but also table wines? And I said this once in Glasgow, but never again, that if we could kind of crack that nut, then Australian whiskey would be more Australian than Scotch is Scottish, because of course those barrels come from Kentucky or Portugal, Spain or France with wines. So that got me excited, that actually we do have the ability to be as, if not more, but as compelling a product that talks to the place it's made from an ingredients perspective as the whiskies from around the world that I hold in high esteem. So it's really exciting, in theory, and then you've got to go and do it. And so for about, we started production in January 2010. So it was a long gestation period to kind of get all the bits and pieces in place. And then launched in 2013 with our first product, which was Solera, which has been in the UK for, I'm going to say from about 2015 onwards. We've been exporting to the United Kingdom, but it only recently arrived in the United States earlier this year. So Solera is a tip of the hat to that kind of vatting methodology that's used in bodegas in Spain particularly. But the style of wine is called Apera, which is in and of itself, I guess, a bit of a tip of the hat to sherry. It used to be called sherry in Australia, but if a Spaniard ever drank it, they'd kind of be mortally offended by that kind of nomenclature. So fortified wine, amazing fortified wine barrels that it produced. So these barrels have been in production for 40 or 50 years at the winery, and so by the time we get them, they're just saturated with all of that fortified wine characteristic and amazing. But they're really old, so we shaved, toasted, and recharred those barrels, and then resized them into 50 litre, 100 and 200 litre barrels that was an ability for us to kind of take advantage of different size barrels and the intensity of flavor that comes out of them, but at the same time frame. Because if we're talking about a whiskey from the place it's made, of course the ingredients are important, but the climate is equally important. And for those that have visited Melbourne, they'll know that we're famous for our 4 seasons in a day. It can be anywhere upwards of 40 degrees Celsius, and then sudden wind change to the south, and all of a sudden it's 20 degrees. So we can have these huge temperature shifts in a really short time frame. That means that we're working those barrels really, really hard. In fact, I think we've got the hardest working barrels in the world because of that always changing environment. That means that the spirit and the oak are always interacting. So 50s, 100s, and 200s gave us light and shade, but at the same time, which is about three years. I call it 3 Melbourne years. And then we launched Nova, and that was really the first of its kind as a major release, and certainly one that was affordably priced. Nova's fully matured in Australian red wine barrels from the day it's made. So there's lots of wine finishes on the market, but very few wine starts, that have all of their maturation. Certainly when we launched that, very, very few fully wine matured whiskies. And the benefit of that and our location is that we have, within a day's drive, 90% of red wine production in Australia. So we can have wine go out in the afternoon and the barrels transported to the distillery the next day, and then have whiskey go in, new make spirit, the immature spirit go in. So this is minimal intervention whiskey. Like we've got the barley doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the brews. Fermentation obviously playing a part in terms of adding characters. We're just concentrating those flavors in the still, and then putting them into these barrels that they're not virgin oak barrels because they've had wine in them beforehand, but the wine hasn't just infused character in, it's also taken some of the flavors that actually for a whiskey you don't want in your product, and the reason why you char a barrel out. So and one of those, if you think about a red wine that you're thinking of cellaring, it's got a lot of tannin to give it structure for cellaring age. And so tannins can be quite astringent and clawing in the mouth, and we're really fortunate that all the tannins in the barrel are in the wine, not the whiskey. but we get all of these virgin oak characteristics like baking spices and toasted oak characteristics coming through because we haven't charred the barrel to within an inch of its life. So most barrels that are used in whiskey production are charred. We've got a bit of charring going on in Nova for light and shade again, but most of those barrels are wet wine barrels, still saturated with wine when we fill them with whiskey, which is very, very amazing, a unique kind of approach to whiskey making. But again, because we're so close to those wineries in Australia, it means that it's easy for us to do in a way that, it's logistically challenging if you're in the Highlands of Scotland to get barrels. Well, they wouldn't be Scottish wineries, would they? There's barely enough sun to grow a grape, let alone a winery. But even if we're talking France, to get them from some of those amazing wine producers in France to a distillery in the Highlands is going to take you a fair bit of time. And by the time they get there, the wine might be in its optimal state to then just put whiskey in. So you need to process the barrel a little more than we do.
No, I understand. I understand that. I used to when I used to live in Australia. Obviously, I'm Australian. When I used to live in Australia, something I would do is I would go to the Mornington Peninsula and I would go to the wineries and I would buy old red wine casks and I would cut them open. I would turn them into drinks cabinets. So I take the front off, put some shelving in, put another reform the staves, and then you have a door. And what always struck me was how incredibly rich, because these guys, they've just emptied this wine barrel and they're saying, yeah, you can take this. It's going to cost you $50, $60 or something, cheap as chips. And seeing that, and then when I got to Scotland and I was, recasking something, or I was filling a cask, and I would put my head in the barrel and go, oh, it's dry as a bone in here. And I understand, there's going to be some wood retention, but I always loved that smell of being able to open up a cask and go, this is 24 hours ago. This had some of the best red wine in the world inside it. And now I get to play with it. And I can imagine you would have thought that as well whenever you were filling those casks with your whiskey.
Yeah, because the interesting thing is, winemakers don't need to use barrels or casks to get all of those oak characteristics and the tannins in there. They can use oak staves, they can use wood chips, oak chips, or all sorts of different things to add oak influence into a wine. So those that are using wine barrels are a cut above. So some of the wineries that we can source barrels from are icons of the Australian kind of wine scene. Having said that, what we've learnt over the time is that, an amazing $100 wine that's got amazing barrel that's made $100 wine that's won 95 points doesn't necessarily make a great Starward wine barrel. And so we've kind of, over the years, and the way we operate fundamentally as a business is that in the brew house and the still house where we make the spirit, we're employing brewers from the microbrewing scene in Melbourne, and in the bond store and the blending house and in the downstream side of things where we're packaging products are winemakers. And so the winemakers have been really good at kind of identifying and talking to the wineries that we use and the winemakers there to understand, I guess, the winemaker's wood policy so that we know what's going to work for us as a barrel of Starward that makes these amazing whiskies.
No, that's quite something. And I guess as well, considering that you were previously a brewer, did you have, when you started Starward, did you have any hand in the wash that was used for the initial whiskies?
Yeah, so basically, yes and no. I kind of took care of the stills because that was an area where I was less likely to stuff things up and make expensive mistakes. And employee number one, who was working, had been a brewer, basically took care of the wash and fermentation. But what I did have was some would argue an unhealthy amount of knowledge, enough to be dangerous in terms of brewing, to be then go and say, well, why don't we push the envelope in terms of temperature and fermentation? what are we thinking about in terms of the clarity of the wort that we're using for making the the fermented wash, and all those that sort of aspects. What style of malt are we going to use? So, early on, our malts were closer to an amber ale than they were a pilsner. And again, in terms of color, if you think of Guinness being at one end and a pilsner being at the other, there's a lot of difference in that color, and that color equals character and flavor. And so we figured that going a little darker would give us a more kind of robust and rich spirit that could stand up to those amazing wine barrels that we're using and the climate that we're maturing the whiskey in.
Oh, fantastic. And I mean, so we touched on this earlier, but you launched the Nova a while ago. You've also released a line of products called the NWP, the New World Projects. And I remember seeing you had a variety of casks. Are you continuing with the New World Projects? Can you trying to push boundaries there?
Hold on.
I can see some behind you, yeah.
There's some over there, right? Yeah, look, they're great. Look, I mean, the thing about the team in Melbourne is that they're extremely talented and curious, and that's something that because actually, if I think back to Starward and the genesis of the idea, it was born of curiosity, and so for me, we always want to just have these unexamined ideas in the world of whiskey that we can take for a walk, and sometimes they don't work out that great, and then other times they do, and then sometimes they're predictable but unexpected from Starward. That's probably another version of projects. So for example, we exclusively mature our whiskies in red wine barrels. That's what we're known for, or Australian wine barrels. So we've got some bourbon cask release projects, which we know what they're going to do, but they're just not Starward in a way, right? So, in a way that it's the unexpected, because it's unexpected from us, even though the product itself is bloody delicious. So, we love projects because it gives us the opportunity to take these ideas for a walk in a way that, larger distilleries struggle to do and still maintain that intimacy with drinkers. So I actually found this the other day, which is pretty special. This one's a bottled cocktail from 2016, so well before the trend of, at-home cocktails and things like that. I don't know if you can see that or not.
We'll pull a still up on a later, maybe.
Yeah. So the point is that we've been experimenting with bottled cocktails for a while now, because for us, whiskey in and of itself is an amazing drink, but the thing that we get most excited about is the versatility it has in cocktails, and particularly whiskies like ours that are matured in wine barrels give people at home that are want to be a bit of a foodie but with drinks, or bartenders, the ability to play and riff off that we've already put in with, and that way he then becomes, I guess, a cast member in a movie, just one cast member that we kind of developed, but the bartender becomes the director and kind of brings all of those flavors together to create something really interesting, the sum of the parts couldn't compete with.
That's fantastic. And I mean, obviously, in line with that, the Australian regulations for whiskey and for distillation are pretty notoriously small. I mean, looking through the old, the government's regulations, and then I think it's the AWA or the ADA, whatever they're saying, if you consider that America has dozens of pages, Scotland has dozens of pages, Ireland has 14 pages. Australia's whiskey regulations are really, I feel like there's about 3 lines of text or so. So it's really open there.
It's open. My kind of comment on that is that they're so shoot a cannon through them. Like it just gives us so much ability to play and experiment and innovate. And I'm so grateful that I think it was by accident, to be honest, but that they have been so elegantly simple, because they do cover off on all the key bits that those chapters and reams of paper do in Scotland and Kentucky particularly. But it's just a simple definition of, like, a whiskey is a fermented grain mash that's distilled and spends a minimum of 2 years in wood. That's it. Oh, and has all the characteristics of whiskey. So it's a self-referential definition, which is, I think, I know why it's there. It's actually to avoid excise loopholes for other products. So every alcoholic beverage has the characteristics of, because a lot of people were making RTD drinks which tasted like a spirit, like a vodka, lime, and soda, but using a malt base, and the malt base excise was a lot lower than the vodka.
Okay.
Excise. So if you're going to call it a beer, it needs to look like a beer and taste like a beer. If you're gonna make a whiskey, it's got to look like a whiskey and taste like a whiskey. But the definition of whiskey is ever evolving, because it just has to refer to that layperson test of what is a whiskey. And so I think it's an elegantly simple way of managing the boundaries of what's off territory.
Well, speaking of the boundaries as well, we'll head back to the what we were first talking about, the Starward twofold. As I understand, I think this is one of, if not your most latest release. Can you tell us about the whiskey?
Yeah, so that was launched in October 2018, and I have to say this has been a label of mine since day one. Not because the single malts aren't amazing whiskies, but in the world of Australian whiskies, most of the whiskies at that point in time were single malt whiskies made in the finest of Scottish traditions. So, we came along and pushed the envelope a bit, maturing in red wine barrel. But for me, what we wanted to do, push it again and give something that had a firm place in that sharing cabinet at home. So this is a double grain whiskey. It's wheat, 60% wheat spirit that's matured in red wine barrels, separate to the 40% effectively Nova that's matured in wine barrels, and then we marry them at the end. Really simple reason for that is I didn't know whether it would be 50-50, 40-60, 60-40. So we just kind of separated them out and then thought we'd figure it out at the other end of the process. And it gives us more room to play as well, just in terms of innovation. But twofold is great because it's just really approachable. Like, it is kind of a 12 o'clock whiskey, like it is kind of that whiskey that you can sip, and it delivers on the promise of those whiskeys mature barrels, but it has a smooth kind of rounding kind of flavor profile because of that wheat spirit that we're using. In America, this was a wheated whiskey, but for one issue, and that's that we mature our whiskies in red wine barrels. And in Scotland, this is most like a blended whiskey, but blended whiskies don't typically come from the same house, right? All of this spirit is, matured in the house of Starward. So from that perspective, they lean on some definitions from around the world, but we figured that calling it a double grain whiskey, did what the box says. It's kind of like explaining to the person what it does, but also sets it apart from those other product categories that are a little different to what we're trying to do here. And it's great. Like, in Australia, it sits at around the same price point as Glenfiddich 12, which is pretty accessible, and but delivers a really different. If we're talking about Glenfiddich 12 or Buffalo Trace or Maker's Mark or what am I thinking? A Caskmate from Jameson, all that sort of world, that sort of step up world. It's delivering a different flavor profile to those whiskies. And so all of a sudden it's like, well, I'm not using price as a determinant as to what I'm choosing here tonight. I'm using flavor. And, of course, I'm going to say this, I'm the founder. I think we kind of deliver way more bang for buck than the products at the same price point when it comes to flavor.
No, I'll agree with that. I mean, I'm in Ireland at the moment. I get this from the Whiskey Exchange, which is UK based. I think I pay 40, maybe £50 for it, but I could pay 40 or £50 for a whiskey that is just so-so, or I could pay £50 for this, and I'm happy spending £50 for that. I'd be happy spending £60 on it. I think it's a fantastic whiskey.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I mean, the wheat really goes in. Speaking of the wheat as well, I mean, if you do still microbrew from time to time, did you run any trials doing any kind of wheat beers before you before you're really satisfied with this?
One of the key decisions we made early on when we were prototyped, like what is an Australian whiskey and what does it look like? So this is back in 2007 through 2010. We circled around single malt, not because it's a premium product or not because it tastes better. It's really easy to make. That's the simple truth. Like a brew house made to make malt whiskey is far simpler than the brew houses that you'll see making a rye or other grains that require more, if they're using rice, for example, like all these sorts of different grains are far more complex to ferment and to extract the sugars to ferment. So early on, we did do some wheat beer trials, but none of them really went anywhere. And then when we decided to kind of full tilt into twofold, given the scale we were looking at, it would have required tens of millions of dollar investment in a brew house and still house to kind of underwrite the sort of volumes that we were chasing that we thought were potentially available with twofold. And despite my appetite for risk and giving things a go, that just seemed to me a step too far when we had all of these other risky aspects to kind of deal with, which is like, it's a modern Australian whiskey. Does anyone really care about Australian whiskey around the world? We're maturing in wine barrels. We love them, but does the rest of the world love them? Can we get it to a price point that's affordable if we invest all of that infrastructure ourselves to get it there? Probably not. And what's plan B, with a $20 million grain still, if it doesn't work? Not much. So we partnered with a distillery that actually had already invested and continues to invest in making a wheat spirit to create our own specific bespoke style of whiskey spirit from that distillery that we then mature in our wine barrels back at home. And so that kind of short circuited a lot of the investment risk, for want of a better term. And it sounds really boring talking about investment risk on a what whiskey podcast, but that's part of this startup world. And meant that we could over invest in innovation and product trials on the spirit. So we parlayed all of that saving, particularly in time and money, into developing the best possible spirit we could in partnership with that distillery that then goes into all of our barrels. So it's just another way of kind of approaching it. And it's one of the reasons why we can sit on the shelf for 40 or 50 quid, in the UK.
Oh, it's fair. It's fantastic. I mean, something that you've mentioned yourself and something I've heard from people is that Starward is often considered the mixologist and the cocktail bartender's whiskey. Using it, they can create all manner of things. What's your kind of thought on this? Because I think it's a whiskey for everyone. But your personal thoughts, do you rather it being seen as a cocktail whiskey or as a sipping whiskey?
No, I don't have a firm view. I think that for us, it needs to be a great sipping whiskey because, probably less so now, but when I was on my whiskey journey to start off on that discovery of whiskeys, looked to people sort of in that whiskey world and thinking about how they characterized a quality product, a well-crafted product. And there's a difference between well-crafted and I like it, right? Because
Yeah.
like is subjective and it's taste oriented. Well-crafted is a little more objective, right? And so we always want to make a well-crafted whiskey that's easy, is easy to sip. Approachability is one of our key kind of drivers, both in terms of flavor but price. Our middle daughter's name's Isla, right? Like, we love peated whiskies at home, but we just don't think that that's an approachable whiskey that Starward could make and own. I mean, you can't out Lafroig, right? Like, they kind of have it
Yeah.
cornered and done. But also, I love those peated whiskies, but they're not your first rung on the ladder of discovery. And so for me, the vision I had for Starward was to kind of have accessible, approachable whiskies. So they're great sipping whiskies, but they also have, and this is the hard bit, a distinctive flavor profile, a robustness of character that means that when you mix them and make a highball or my favorite, which is a twofold and tonic, or put them in a cocktail, a classic cocktail or a new cocktail, that it's not just whiskey, that it's Starward you're using and it comes through. And that was the trick, and the masterstroke and the good fortune that we were able to kind of tap across was the fact that these red wine barrels give that familiarity of flavor. It's an approachable flavor, but it also is quite distinctive.
No, that's fantastic, and I completely agree with you as well. I mean, your whiskey has a taste, and Australia is known for wine, and hopefully with your whiskey, Australia will be known for that wine cask whiskey and that boisterous, strong, really bold flavor. Speaking of that as well, obviously the current Australian whiskey industry is young, and because of that, a lot of the bottles are quite young. Do we have any plans or any idea in the future if we might see older bottlings, or are you really leaving that to one side and just focusing on making good, affordable whiskey?
Yeah, look, I think you have to ask why, right? Like, what's the purpose of aging whiskey longer? And I think there's good reasons for Scotch whiskey, particularly to be aged a longer period of time. It needs more time. It's far less, the environment's far less reactive. It doesn't have those huge temperature swings, so things take longer. From our point of view, we do have a sweet spot in our bond store of 3 to 5 years. That's the sweet spot of, like, if we leave whiskey in the bond store for longer than 5 years, actually we are at risk of not improving the quality and character of the whiskey, and anything we release won't be well crafted from that product range. So that's the one constraint that we have, just in terms of the environment that we're maturing whiskey in. But moreover, and that's different. Like Tasmania, I think Sullivan's Cove typically take 12 or 13 years to mature their whiskey to get it to that point, right? And it's reflected in the price. So, I have a strong view that there's a place for aged whiskies depending on where they come from. So, time is constant, but it does have a different meaning, in terms of elapsed time when you're talking about Melbourne versus Scotland, right? As an example, and Tasmania for that matter. And then I think the second point is that we want to be in that sharing cabinet, and the longer you leave a whiskey in bond, you're evaporating more. It just means that you have to recover those costs over less liquid, which means that you're going to be paying more for it at the counter, right? That's just a simple supply and demand mathematical equation. And guess what? Like, I'm nostalgic. I love the idea of drinking a whiskey that was put into a barrel 18 years ago, right? Or 25 years ago. And it's a snapshot of time. So you should be paying a premium for that too. So, but it's just not our gig. It's not what we're into, and it would be really difficult for us to do that in Melbourne anyway.
No, I get that. I mean, obviously, the big question is, what's your distillery doing at the moment? With I understand Australia's on lockdown as well. Is the distillery distilling, or are they converted to hand sanitizer? What's happening there?
Well, I don't know if it was fortuitous or not. I still haven't figured out what side of the fence I'm on, but the statement of fact is that we're actually shut down for this period of time doing a production upgrade. So we are doubling our capacity. So as of the 1st of July, we'll be making double the amount of whiskey that we were beforehand every week, which is pretty exciting. You know, that we're continuing on that growth trajectory. And this distillery is, well, by the time we launched, nearly 3 years old, right? So in that context, we're barely emptying the barrels that we started to fill at this site, and we're already doubling the production again. So pretty exciting, and that upgrade was like a 10 times increase in production. So we're really starting to ramp up. So it did mean that we weren't able to kind of pivot into sanitizer production, which was desperately needed in local communities. But it did provide us with the opportunity to support local. We're doing it around the world. In fact, we're supporting local hospitality venues who are supporting either bartenders and hospitality workers, feeding them, or in one instance we've been able to help a restaurant in Chicago deliver over 6,000 meals to frontline hospital workers that just don't have the time or inclination to be cooking a meal of an evening. So that's been the way that we've really kind of pivoted in this period, is to say, well, you know what, we've been really fortunate to have the support of these bars and bartenders and the general hospitality industry for quite some time, and they're doing it tough, and we just wanted to lean in and support them and offer them meals and whatever we can to support them through that time. So that's kind of what we've been doing. We've still, fortunately, retail is still open, and in Australia that's been great for us. I think people aren't necessarily wandering the corridors of a US retailer exploring the New World whiskey category. They're kind of walking in, getting what they know, and walking out. But fortunately for us in Australia, people, we do have a bit of brand awareness, and people, particularly with Twofold, love us, and that's their go-to sharing cabinet whiskey, which is quite a privilege and very humbling to kind of have that place in people's whiskey cabinet.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, going through it, I think I know the answer to this, but of your range, what is your favorite whiskey?
They're all like my kids. So I don't have any favorites, but depending on the day of the week, one will be more favored than the other. Look, at the moment, I'm drinking a lot of Twofold and tonic. Like, it's a low ABV, refreshing drink. We're coming into summer in the Pacific Northwest, which is absolutely glorious, and it just hits the spot for me. But each of them have their special place in my heart, because obviously without Solera, which is our firstborn, we wouldn't be here today. And Nova really pushed the envelope in terms of flavor profile with whiskeys, and I think that put us on the map, and particularly when we won double gold best in class. So that's kind of the best craft whiskey in the world in 2016 with Nova. That was just a kind of so they all are very, very, very special to me, but in different ways.
Hey, you are definitely describing your children. You're about like that. Is there a way that we can keep in touch with Starward and with yourself? Is there anywhere we can go to keep in touch?
Yeah, well, obviously, social media today, everybody's got their phone in their hand. So our Instagram's at Starward Whiskey, no E, the proper way. And then we're Starward Whiskey on Facebook as well. I am David Vitale is my Instagram handle, so by all means follow me. And well, I'm on Twitter as well, so happy to kind of keep people in the loop as to what we're doing and how we're kind growing hopefully this whiskey into an Australian icon one day.
No, I've no doubt there will be. Now, I can't remember if I actually told you about this, but something I do like to do at the end of these is do a little quiz,
Right.
just as it's a kind of fun piece.
Mm-hmm.
And for yourself, because I read that you were a microbrewer, so I've got a couple of beer questions here.
Boy. Okay, here we go.
All right. Now, first one. Where do these beers come from?
Oh no. Okay. Because I'm going red in the face. This is terrible.
You'll get at least one. I know you'll get at least one.
Okay.
New Belgium.
The US.
Yes.
Yep.
Jaws.
The UK.
No, actually, that one's Russian. Russian, a Russian craft beer. Someone sent me a little bit recently, and it's actually pretty bloody nice. Okay. O'Clock Brewing.
O'Clock Brewing. Ireland.
Is there a place called O'Clock Brewing in Maryland?
No, Ireland.
Oh, Ireland. Oh, sorry, no. No, that one's France.
There you go. I just figured the O apostrophe. I thought I'd give it a go.
No, I don't know. Fat Yak.
Well, that's literally down the road from us.
There you go. Yeah, Australian.
Yep.
And the last one on that list, Tuatara.
New Zealand.
Yeah, that's a Kiwi one. A bit hoppy for me, but yeah. So next question. While hops add flavor, what else do they do for the beer?
Oh, bittering. They bitter. They make it more bitter.
They bitter, but they have another action with the beer with that helps.
Oh, it stabilizes.
Yeah, stabilize and preservation, preserve, and all that.
Yes.
Yeah. What does we throw the term lager around quite a lot, but where does that come from? What does lager mean?
It's fundamentally fermentation's the key area that kind of differentiates lager and ales, and typically they're lower temperature fermentations.
I'm gonna go with got that one right.
Okay.
And lastly, I always love this one. Which ship famously stopped wear because they had run out of beer?
That is a classic question. I don't know.
I would say arguably one of the most famous ships and one of the most famous voyages in the entire world and in all of human history.
Wow. Like Marco Polo's ship?
Potentially, but what I'm actually looking for is the Mayflower.
The Mayflower, there you go.
Stopped at Plymouth Rock. Not because it looked good, but they had run out of all their supplies, in particular beer, need to brew more beer. Which is, it's
needs must. Yeah, exactly.
So there you have it. America has essentially come from people stopping because they needed beer. And that's fine.
Yep.
All right, that is all the questions I've got. Fun little quiz. Actually researched those ones a little bit, not too heavily, but you've done better than everyone else so far.
Oh, good.
Before we finish, is there anything else you want to say to the people watching now and the people who will be watching in the future?
No, I just want to, say thanks to you, Marcus, and also everybody that supported us. It's very, like I said, it's kind of like this started a long time ago as this light bulb idea that maybe we could take Australian whiskey to the world on a grand scale, and we're not there yet, but we're certainly on our way. And it's always, particularly in these times where things are really volatile and uncertain, it's not something that I take for granted ever. So thank you all.
No, if you want to take Australian whiskey to the world, you've got the damn best product to do it with. and I hope my mates don't watch this because I've got a couple of mates who work at Sullivan's Cove and Lark. But no doubt, I'm more than happy to continually pour Starward for anyone who comes around. But
that's great.
thank you so
And
much.
you know what? I mean, I'd be glad to have them here as well, by the way. Like, it's just kind of very difficult to build a category with one product. You know, when they're ready, I'll embrace them with open arms, particularly in the US. Yeah.
I will let everyone who asks about Starwood know. I'll send them an email so you can let them know where you live so they can come over for a pint and a whiskey.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Well, David, thank you so much for coming on today. Thank you so much for doing the whiskey and having a chat with us. Everyone, I've been Some Whiskey Bloke. This is Malts with Mates, and thank you.